Everyone, today's mini lesson is focusing on two of Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous writings. One is the I Have a Dream speech, which I know most of you have some familiarity with, and the other one is the letter from Birmingham jail, which instead of being a speech is a document that was published in newspapers. Today we're going to be looking at these famous writings and comparing them to the democratic values, which we've talked about in the last couple of lessons, and we're going to see how they influence the interpretation of the Constitution. The learning target is going to be the same for this lesson and the next lesson, and it states, I can analyze how influential speeches and writing express democratic values and have changed American culture, law, and the Constitution. So in this mini lesson, we're going to break down each of these speeches, but after you complete the mini lesson, you're going to have the opportunity to analyze them in more detail. For now, we're just looking at the major themes. So, first of all, we're going to look at the I Have a Dream speech. The I Have a Dream speech is one of the most famous speeches in history. It was televised, so not only were there thousands of people in person to see this monumental moment, people across the country were able to see it as well. It's one of the most famous televised events from American history and was part of the March on Washington, which was a much larger event based around the civil rights movement. The speech has two main themes, which are racial equality and justice. In the speech, he talks about looking for a better future and hoping that his children live to see the day when things are truly changed. As far as the democratic values referenced in the speech, he references this idea of equality in talking about the civil rights movement. A lot of people consider this one of the founding events in terms of relaunching that civil rights movement. There have been different phases of civil rights movements, but this is one of the most influential in the 1960s. He talks about this concept of justice and fighting for justice in nonviolent ways and talks about freedom. And in doing so, he especially emphasizes ending racial discrimination and segregation. So, discrimination obviously is people being treated differently because of a specific group that they belong to. So, in this case, he was talking about racial discrimination. So, people discriminated based on race. However, one of the other arguments he was making was about segregation. And segregation is talking about the separation of the population based on specific traits, generally related to race or ethnicity. So he was not only fighting for the end of racial discrimination, but he was also fighting for the end of racial segregation. As far as the cultural impact, a lot of historians look at this as the foundation of the 1960s version of the civil rights movement. The 1960s is one of the most fundamental years in terms of the civil rights movement. There have been different waves throughout history as people are coming together to fight for different rights. However, the 1960s are one of the most influential. Especially because this was televised and because people were talking about it, it helped to rally activists and supporters to create a bigger movement across the country and especially advocated for an inclusive and tolerant society. So, where people didn't have to worry about basically the world that their kids are growing up in. As far as the legal impact, it indirectly influenced both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Rights Act of 1965. Now, it didn't specifically call for legislation, it didn't specifically say we need this specific act, but because it rallied people together and got people talking and it started this conversation, it kind of created a domino effect in terms of the legislation that were later created based on some of the basic themes that were initially introduced in the speech. As far as the constitutional influence, he talks about the equal protection under the law. So he's not necessarily talking about changing the Constitution, but rather making sure that the Constitution is being equally enforced for all races. And he also talks about the contradiction between the ideals and the realities. So looking at what the Constitution says versus looking at how people are treated in the country at the time. The letter from Birmingham jail you might not be as familiar with. This is another one of his famous writings. However, instead of giving it as a speech, this was a actual letter that was written from Birmingham jail when he was arrested as being part of a nonviolent protest. In this fairly long letter, he defends nonviolence and confronts injustice of segregation. He again references some of those democratic values that the other one did: equality, justice, freedom. These are really the foundations of the civil rights movement as a whole, and are referenced not only in these two writings, but in many more by Martin Luther King Jr. and several others. He argues that individuals have a moral duty to challenge unjust laws and fight for rights of the oppressed. So he is basically justifying his nonviolent protests and talking about how people have a right to do this and they should be doing this if people are being oppressed. And oppressed is basically talking about how specific groups are being treated and not being fairly protected under the law. He especially highlights civil disobedience and peaceful protests for democratic change. So these were the foundations of his platform, talking about nonviolent protests. There were definitely other members of the civil rights movement who advocated for violent protests. However, Martin Luther King Jr. was a strong advocate for doing things in nonviolent ways that didn't cause harm to others. As far as the legal impact, again, it had an indirect influence on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In terms of the constitutional influence, he wanted a re examination of the Constitution and wanted to the government to live up to the promise of equal protections and due process. So in the Constitution, it talks about equal protection of the law. This was an ideal that dates back to the Declaration of Independence, and all men are created equal. However, time and time again throughout history, it's been proven that while Thomas Jefferson wrote all men are created equal, that was not the case at the time, and still to some extent doesn't remain the same for all groups of the population at any point in history. So he was not necessarily advocating for changes to the Constitution, but rather changes in the enforcement of the Constitution and making sure that that equal protection under the law and due process, meaning if people are accused of doing something, then they get treated the same as everyone else in terms of following the legal regulations of things like juries and things like that that were initially introduced in the Bill of Rights. So, Martin Luther King Jr. has been one of the most influential members of the civil rights movement. However, what doesn't always get discussed is his influence on the law in general and the interpretation of the law in regards to the democratic values. This lesson, you're going to have further opportunities to look at these two pieces of writing in further detail and look at basically how they have influenced those democratic values that we have been learning about within the Constitution, especially.